If you need Spanish interpretation, please click the globe on the bottom right corner of your screen. Si necesita interpretación en español, puede hacerle clic al globo abajo. As always, we like to thank our Board of Education for their support. Tonight we have with us Mr. Kerry Heller, who will be presenting about helping kids and teens with executive function challenges to thrive, a practical guide for the whole family. Kerry Heller is a licensed psychologist and founding partner of Heller Psychology Group in Bethesda, Maryland. He specializes in the evaluation and treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder and executive function weaknesses. Dr. Heller often provides a blend of psychotherapy and practical coaching in helping children, adolescents, and adults get better organized, be more efficient, and improve their productivity. He is also involved with CHAD, serving as the chapter coordinator for the Montgomery County chapter and as the co-chair of the National Editorial Advisory Board. I will now go ahead and turn it over to Mr. Heller.
So what is executive functioning? It's a good question. Always good to define things when you're talking about stuff. Basically, it's a set of mental processes that control many actions. So it's an umbrella term that's used to look at skills like planning, organizing, task initiation. So it's like all the skill sets that you need to complete a task. So for example, with joining the presentation tonight, having to look at your calendar or remember, oh, there's this presentation. Let me hold in my mind, I need to find the Zoom link. And then to grab the Zoom link without getting distracted by something else on your computer or your phone, and then opening it up. So in terms of the way I have it categorized on the slides, for any of you that have had testing completed and remember stuff from the report, these categories of behavioral regulation, emotional regulation, and cognitive regulation may look somewhat familiar. That's because they're used in what's called the Brief 2, which is a self-report measure to look at executive function skills. And I think they do a good job of breaking it down. Because when you think about executive function, there's the behavioral regulation category as far as like stopping yourself from acting on your impulses when it'd be a problem. So the ability to, kind of pause and not say something or do something impulsively, and self-awareness. There's emotional regulation, which looks at both shifting attention. So being able to shift your attention from one task or topic to another, as well as emotional control. And emotional control is not something that people often think about as much with executive functioning, but it's definitely a vital component. Cognitive regulation is kind of what most people think about when they think about executive functioning. So planning, organizing, being able to look at your attainment of a goal. So for kids, it's often checking work during the exam to look at are they answering stuff correctly, things like that. There's a lot. Again, it's not important to have a super great understanding of this for a presentation. Just at least have at least a basic, vague understanding, and anything that's relevant, I'll comment on later on as we go. Okay, so the presentation technically is a little bit more about executive functioning, but I thought it was important to at least mention ADHD, because a lot of times people connect ADHD to executive function challenges and don't always recognize that they're not always the same. So ADHD, if we want to get really technical, it's technically considered a neurodevelopmental disorder in the DSM-5-TR, which is basically the criteria that's used that has this sort of the mental disorders. But basically, the main thing to know, it's essentially a disorder that's characterized by challenges in self-regulation of attention. So trouble with paying attention, sustaining attention. A really key thing here, though, is the idea that it's not just about sustaining attention in general, but you can have kids with ADHD that could spend hours playing video games or doing things they really enjoy, but have a real hard time focusing for 10 minutes on homework. So it's about the idea of having a hard time being able to stay focused in general. So especially on the things that they don't really find as enjoyable or stimulating. So it's about the idea of being stimulated enough. So that's where the self-regulation piece with attention comes into play. In addition, while that's obviously probably one of the more primary sort of things, a lot of people with ADHD, not all, but certainly a fair amount, also have issues with what's called hyperactivity, so excessive movements. So fidgeting, the child who can't sit still or constantly gets up, as well as impulsivity in terms of saying things without thinking, doing things without thinking. So as you can see here on the slides, there's combined presentation, which basically means that someone has clinically significant issues with attention, as well as hyperactivity and impulsivity. There's predominantly an attentive presentation where they can still have some symptoms of hyperactivity, but they're not as prominent and not enough that it warrants the diagnosis of the combined part. So the attention issues are more prominent. There's also the predominantly hyperactive impulsive one. I mean, anecdotally, I don't see that one quite as often, but it's definitely one there. But the point is that basically it impacts attention, and also because if thinking about attention, planning, organizing, like all this stuff, basically, if at least the way that I conceptualize ADHD, if someone has ADHD, they by default have weaknesses in executive functioning. However, people can also have executive function issues that are not due to ADHD. That's really the key distinction I wanted to make. Okay, so I want to just touch base very briefly on why people have some weaknesses in executive functioning, because this is going to tie into what we're going to talk about in a few minutes when we get to all the practical stuff. Okay, so there can be different reasons why kids and adults as well have some challenges with executive functioning. So there are certainly times where someone just hasn't learned how to do something, especially if it's something new they haven't done before. A lot of people are not going to do something perfectly the first time they do it and know exactly how to plan it out. Like the first time someone is as an adult, the first time you're going somewhere new, you may not get it right, or if you're not great at planning, you may not think, oh, how much traffic do I need to allow? Time do I need to allow for traffic? Or whatever the my kid, how long do I need to allow in case my kid throws a tantrum before I have to leave? And have to sort of navigate that before. So again, you can't plan for everything, but the idea is that the sometimes it's just not having mastered a specific skill set that can be part of the reason. There's also or limited for kids, limited experience doing something, that if they're suddenly tasked with the idea of I need to figure out how do I look, let's say on Canvas in my homework assignments, assuming Canvas isn't down. I know today it was down, but normally the idea of if they're not used to doing something, most kids are going to need some scaffolding, some support. You can't expect them to do all the stuff on their own for the first time. So sometimes limited experience can impact executive function skills. Again, ADHD certainly is a very big one that does impact executive functioning a lot, but almost any other mental health disorder can. Anxiety, depression, OCD. There's countless things, lack of sleep. There's, many, many things that can impact executive functioning. Okay, so we're going to touch base briefly on how these things impact things at school as well as at home, just because then we're going to look at how do we target, making these things better. So again, some of these are probably self-explanatory things that you probably have your own kids that struggle with, or maybe some things you struggle with yourself, but trouble staying focused, difficulty, completing homework, trouble getting started on things, trouble keeping track of assignments, difficulties planning ahead, doing long-term assignments all at the last minute, not really knowing how to study effectively, and trouble following multi-step directions. In terms of things at home, and again, obviously with kids, you probably see these things even more since you see your kids, even more at home. So certainly staying focused, even when you're having conversation with them, can be fairly common, or being given instructions, trouble completing chores, maybe having to nag them a million times to get stuff done, probably getting frustrated if you keep asking them and they're not doing stuff, or they're, I don't know, playing a video game and they say, I'll do it in 5 minutes. And then 5 minutes turns into an hour. And maybe they have no concept of how long 5 minutes actually is, or they have no plan to actually how they're going to remember when it's been 5 minutes to get off. So the point is there's a lot of different things that can impact executive functioning. And what you see as far as, challenges with planning ahead, running late for things. If you have a hard time with regulating time and navigating time, you're also less likely to get enough sleep also, because you're not getting yourself to bed at a reasonable an hour. So there's lots of things that can be a result of poor executive function skills. Okay. So we've now reached kind of from here on out, it's pretty much all practical stuff, which is definitely my favorite part of these presentations, more so than talking about the conceptual stuff. Okay, so the first thing we really want to look at in general is we always want to identify what is the problem or issue. Because you can't just target executive functioning and say, I'm going to make it better. I mean, theoretically you could, but you probably wouldn't really accomplish much. So the idea is that we want to identify what is the specific problem or issue. And then my suggestion is, to the extent you can, try to work collaboratively with your child to determine possible solutions. Because if you can incorporate them in the development of strategies to make it better, you're more likely to get their buy-in. And even if whatever you come up with initially doesn't work, they may be more willing to listen to you later on with things, as opposed to you saying you have to do it this way and that's the only way to do it. So it's definitely important to work collaboratively with kids. Try to keep strategies as simple as possible. Kind of like I mentioned earlier, where a lot of kids with executive function challenges have a hard time multi-step directions. If you could create this super elaborate plan that maybe in theory could work very well, but if a child can't follow all those steps, it's really not going to be very helpful. The other big principle is the idea of really helping your child to work towards promoting greater independence. Because the benefit of that is it helps them to do more themselves, and actually it also takes more responsibility or takes some responsibility off yourself. Like, because if you have to be completely involved in every single plan they do, you're not really helping them out quite as much to be independent. So the key things here are to really identify the problem or issue, keep things as simple as possible, and really work towards trying to help your child to be more independent in any strategies that you're using. Okay, so now we're going to actually talk about the practical strategies. All right. So one of the things that's really common in terms of challenges are issues with routines, which is, I guess, hence the name of the presentation. So morning, evening, and some other routines are certainly quite common. So the big thing with a routine to ask yourself is, is the routine working effectively? And if not, why? So here's a simple strategy that you can use with your child to start trying to tackle routines. Well, obviously the morning evening routines connect. It's probably better to start with one, look at that, and then, after you've had a discussion on one, move to the other, rather than trying to do too much with both at once. But the idea really is, let's say you pick the morning routine. What you can do is list out everything that needs to occur or does happen and estimate the completion times. So the really important thing about the completion times is most time, kids get up, they may do a lot themselves, or they may be sort of asked by you repeatedly to do various things throughout the morning, but they probably don't have a super clear sense of how long things actually take. So if a child gets up at, I don't know, 7:15, does that give them enough time to do everything they need to do before they either have to get out the door to go to the bus or walk to school or get driven to school? I mean, they may have no idea. I mean, obviously, it also depends. Are they, supposed to get up at 7:15, but don't actually get out of bed until 7:45, or are they actually up nice and early and they have almost 2 hours, but they spend a lot of time watching TV or reading and lose track of time, and then are rushing to get ready last minute? The point is that to list out everything that they need to do, figure out, does the time actually work? Because if it turns out they don't actually have enough time to do everything they need to do, that's a good starting point. Because there's no way the routine could actually work if they actually don't have enough time. And in that case, they either get up earlier, or you can cut down, if possible, the things you need to do. So let's look at this a little bit. Okay, so here's an example of a child's current routine. So they get up at 6:30. They read or play for 4 or 5 minutes, which can be good to have some downtime. If there's something in the morning, they eat breakfast while they're reading a book. And then the parent repeatedly asks the child from 7:50 to 8 to get dressed. So again, 10 minutes of nagging probably is not necessary or ideal, and probably not pleasant for either the parent or the child. Um, and then in this example, they pick out clothing, and get dressed, and then they jump on their iPad for a few minutes, brush teeth, get socks on, and get out the door, but they're rushing. So with an hour and 52 minutes, they still can't get out the door without rushing. So let's look at how to, based on this current routine, let's look at how to make this routine better for this fictional child. Okay, so the first thing to do is to look at what's necessary. So if we break it down from that original list, getting up, obviously they have to get up. Eating breakfast. Breakfast is definitely very important. They should eat breakfast. What you may notice here is that we estimate 15 minutes for breakfast, which it was taking the child about 35 minutes for breakfast because they were busy reading while they were eating. Getting dressed, brushing teeth, packing a backpack. So interestingly, if you look at the bare minimum of the things that the child needs to do in the morning, it only should take about 35 minutes, which means that if they have an hour and 52 minutes, there's more than enough time to get ready where they shouldn't be rushing to get ready at the last minute. So let's look at how to take all this stuff and adjust the routine a little bit to make it better for everyone. Okay, so a few questions you want to ask as you're figuring this out. Is there enough time to complete everything without rushing? Um, is your child still rushing? So in this example, the child is rushing even though there's well more than enough time to get stuff done. Sometimes adjusting the order can make sense. So sometimes it's the idea of, if you get all ready before you eat breakfast, maybe it's less you have to stop doing to go do something else that's easier. Or maybe if your child gets their socks and shoes on earlier in the morning and they're completely ready to go, it's easier to get them out the door last minute. Or looking at, is it if they have to go from one room to the next, less. So if they're running around the house or wherever they live to be able to, I don't know, brush their teeth, and it's easier to just, I don't know, brush their teeth in the kitchen. If it's, they don't have to go get distracted by going to another room, maybe that saves a lot of time. Another thing to look at is, would having free time in the morning be a good motivator to get stuff done earlier? For some kids, that really can be. So those are a couple of things you want to think about with the morning routine, and a lot of other routines in general to ask. Okay, so now we have the modified morning routine plan. So they get up at the same time, so they get dressed first, and they picked out their clothes the night before, which is where the nighttime routine comes into play and having some planning involved in that also. But so they're basically getting up, they're getting dressed, which saves the shifting of having to go eat breakfast and then get dressed. So in this situation, they have 15 minutes to read or play, which is somewhat similar to reading when they're eating breakfast, but they eat breakfast without reading or playing, which means that they're eating breakfast more efficiently. And then after breakfast, they transition into packing their lunch, water bottle, and anything else. So since they have to stop eating anyway, it's a natural transition time to get stuff ready. They then brush teeth. And then at that point, they have 20 minutes of free time. And so they're pretty much ready. They get that free time. And then there's actually even enough time with this setup to actually do physical activity or play time as a family and get 30 minutes of that before having some additional playtime, getting socks and shoes on, and getting out the door. And so you take the same amount of time, and actually a few minutes less because they actually got ready earlier, and they're able to get ready without having to rush. So again, it just illustrates it's about how you structure the time, that in terms of shifting stuff around to be able to make the routines go more smoothly, that can make a huge difference. Okay. So in terms of keeping track, the schedule, activities, supplies, etc. So a couple of things here that are important to do. So first of all, there's the idea or suggestion I have is using a visual calendar or a schedule in a common area, because for a lot of kids, I mean, especially younger ones that are not on technology very much, having something that they can easily see right in front of them. So like some sort of whiteboard or a chalkboard, something where they can see the weekly schedule in front of them. Whether it's in the kitchen or some other place by the front door, it allows them to sort of visualize easily, what do I have to do each day after school? For older kids or kids that use technology a fair amount, sometimes having both is helpful. So even if a child has access to an iPad quite a bit, or stuff on their school Chromebook, it still can be helpful to have something visually out. But they could, basically what they could do is you could have a shared family calendar. So this way the events get added automatically. So if you add something in, your child can see it on their device. For younger elementary school age kids, they make various kids calendar apps. There's a list at the end of apps I'll mention that, and there's some certainly for young kids for calendars too. But in most cases, as long as kids are old enough or are able to read okay, usually just using an Apple Calendar or Google Calendar can often work well. You can also print out the calendar for kids weekly. So that can definitely help a lot, because then this way they don't have to constantly be on a device to see it, and it saves them to rewrite everything every week. In terms of physical organization, so a couple of things to think about. So the main thing is to, first of all, have a set place that's logical to your child for most things. The problem is sometimes people try to, for a parent, the way that you conceptualize keeping stuff organized may be different than your child. And so if you want your child to put stuff in a certain place, but it makes absolutely no sense to them why to do it that way, they're probably less likely to buy into it. So you want to get a sense of what actually makes sense. So I like the laundry hamper example. So, I definitely experience a lot of kids I work with where, there's a constant complaint of the parents of, oh, my child doesn't put their laundry, in the hamper. It just goes on the floor. And so my first question to them, where is the hamper? So a lot of times it's in the closet or somewhere out of view. So, but then my next question is where to the child is, where do they get undressed and change? So a lot of them, let's say, do it near their bed. So if you put the laundry hamper near the bed, if possible, then basically they're standing right in front of the hamper when they take off their clothing and change, and they're then more likely to put the laundry in the hamper because it's right there. Same thing with trash. I mean, I don't know, but I'm definitely amazed at how many kids end up just like leaving trash all over the place because the trash can's not right in front of them. So the idea is by keeping stuff like visually where it's like right in front of you, there's less steps involved to do it, you increase the likelihood of follow through on it. In terms of other things like completing homework, chores, it can be really helpful to create a schedule for things after school each day and to have it written out in some way. Certainly if kids have a lot of activities like sports practices and things like that, having a clear schedule of when they not only the time that it starts, but the time they have to leave is really important. Because the problem is, kids may have a hard time working backwards. So even if you say practice starts at 5:30, if they see 5:30 in the calendar, they may think, "Oh, I need to leave at 5:30." If they really think that far ahead to begin with. But if they have to leave at 5:10, that's a 20-minute difference. The next thing to then figure out is what time do they actually need to get dressed or ready based on what they have to do before they leave. So you sort of have to work backwards to help them figure out what time do they actually need to leave at and what time do they really have to start getting ready. And so really writing this all out. And same thing with scheduling homework time, but also recognizing that homework time may look different each day of the week based on activities. Using natural transitions, like when you first get home or return from activity or after dinner, can be really helpful in making it easier to shift one activity to another. Because it's often easier to get a child to, when they first come home, maybe have a quick snack, and then when they're done eating, then do homework. It's probably easier than trying to get them off of playing video games an hour later to suddenly try to start their homework. I mean, again, some kids need a longer break to unwind after school, which is fine. But recognizing if it's really hard to shift from something they really like doing to something else, being able to create a more of a natural transition can make it easier with going from one thing to another. Um, and again, you can also like during breaks, you can make plans for what kids are going to do. Like I think even just even have free time, active time outside. If the weather's nice, like having that stuff written to a schedule can certainly be helpful if kids aren't always going to think, oh, I should do this, or if it feels better to them to see all the fun stuff laid out along with things they don't really want to do. Like same thing with like shower time and things like that. All right, in terms of planning out, time, completion of assignments. So for homework time, often can be helpful to, in the schedule I was talking about before, to block out specific time blocks based on how long homework. I realize, for elementary school kids, a lot of times the homework is, maybe 10, 15 minutes, I would guess, give or take a little bit depending on the age, if that. Plus maybe 30 minutes of reading sometimes. So you can look at like when in the afternoon after school does it make sense to do assignments and to sort of have that time blocked out. So this way they can see that along with time to play with their friends, around soccer practice or whatever else they have, just to see that. Um, as far as actually planning out the completion goes, I mean for younger kids, I mean if they have a weekly schedule they get or it's listed in Canvas, they can pretty much look at the weekly schedule and it may be math homework and maybe one other thing. So it may be simple enough to just say, this is my homework time. These are things I need to do. I'm going to look at the schedule. When kids have projects or things like that, and certainly for middle school and high school, then I think you need to do more in the way of planning, of maybe making a list each day of what assignments you're going to work on and estimating the completion times, or for a project, how long you're going to allocate to a project. Because the problem is if you have no idea how long anything's going to take and you don't make a plan, you may, especially when you get to high school, kids may spend a lot more time doing homework and then have a lot of stuff that snowballs because suddenly they have 5 hours of homework because they didn't do as much on a project earlier. When you can, I mean, especially if you have teachers that put assignments into Canvas further out, you can sort of make a weekly plan, or at least figure out if let's say on Wednesdays and let's just say Monday and Wednesdays, you have your child has soccer practice, and so that they have substantially less time to do homework. Planning it out where you recognize that they need to get the bare minimum done in those days, but really look at using extra time on Tuesdays and Thursdays to get work done, especially anything that's not due, assigned one day and due the next can be very helpful. So that's where making a weekly plan and adjusting it, or same thing, if you get a packet on Monday through Friday, breaking it down over the course of the week can be very helpful. Okay, so a little bit more on keeping track of assignments. So, and again, some of these are going to vary based on the age, but as far as keeping track of things at school, I mean, it is really important that assignments are tracked in some way. So I realize that certainly for middle school and high school students, a lot of times they're often in Canvas. Again, it's not usually 100%, but they're a lot of times in Canvas. So, that can certainly be helpful, but because they're not 100% in Canvas, it's usually helpful to have some other method to also keep track of assignments, or, like say in the rare case the Canvas is down. But, you know, but basically having, whether it's a paper planner or an electronic planner or even a written checklist, having some simple way to keep track of assignments at a starting point can be good. And then basically at home to basically view all the assignments in the planner, however they are, or have, if you have, let's say, a simple checklist, transfer them at home into more of a master system. So this way you can look at everything, especially all the long-term projects as well. So a couple of ideas here. So for non-electronic ideas, means at home you could write what you're going to do on a whiteboard. Obviously, you're not going to carry a child's not going to carry a whiteboard around during the school day. But at home you could use a whiteboard. At school you can certainly use some sort of paper list, a paper planner, electronic options. There's a program called My Homework that's great. So My Homework, actually, you can sync it to Canvas, so the assignments automatically feed into Canvas, which is great. So then this way you don't have to worry about adding stuff in unless it's not adding Canvas to begin with. I mean, the thing with Canvas is it's basically there's a on the page where it shows the calendar on the bottom right. There's a thing, it says calendar feed, so you can copy the ICS calendar link from the calendar feed in Canvas, and you can basically transfer all the assignments or sync it so that all the assignments transfer into pretty much any computer program that accepts a calendar link. So you can put it all into Google Calendar, Apple Calendar. It's harder with it to put it into a taskless program because most taskless programs won't convert a calendar link and make it a task. I mean, My Homework is one of the few I know of where it'll basically actually turn it into an actual task. But the point is that there's lots of ways if you want to use an external program. My suggestion would be, though, to check your child's school Chromebook and make sure, if they're going to use a program, make sure that the program isn't blocked on the computer, because if they want to use a program at school, you don't want them to suddenly try to get all set at home and then realize, oh wait, I can't actually access the school, unless that's the plan where they just do it at home and transfer it from something on paper at school, which is also another option. Google Tasks is another program that can be helpful. So the nice thing about that is it's probably built into stuff your child's already using at school, because you can open up Google Tasks from there's a little button on the right side of the web browser page. So you can keep Google Tasks open in the same window as the school email account, as as a Google Doc. So it has a lot of flexibility. Todoist and TickTick are other good taskless programs, especially for middle school and high school students, that can be helpful with tracking stuff and planning stuff out in more depth. If kids like to have more flexibility in what they set up, Trello and Google Keep can be good options as well. I mean, there's countless programs you could use. It's really a matter of figuring out for each child, like what do they want to use, what appeals to them, because if they find whatever the program is appealing, they're more likely to use it. All right, so in terms of keeping track of belongings that go to school, so this recommendation is especially helpful. I mean, I imagine that schools appreciate it in terms of hopefully cutting down the amount of things that pile up in the lost and found. And obviously it helps you to sort of not lose, if your child doesn't lose stuff and you have to replace stuff or have to navigate that. So, and again, some kids are better at it than others, but if you have a child that tends to lose things a lot, there are a couple suggestions here. So if needed, you could have a morning checklist at home where you make a list of what's brought to school. So if a coat is brought to school, or a sweatshirt, like if your child tends to lose those a lot, then you at least know, especially if you weren't there in the morning when they went off to school, what coat did they bring? Because, in the morning it's often colder than the afternoon. So, certainly this time of year, it's very possible they may wear a coat in the morning. It's hot. They don't wear in the afternoon, and then, it ends up somewhere. So at least knowing what they were supposed to have come home with could be helpful. You could also put a checklist on their backpack, on a tag on their backpack. So this way, like especially for elementary school age kids, if they're packing up their stuff from a cubby or in a locker, they can sort of see, here's a checklist of what I need to make sure I have and bring home each day. I mean, while I generally don't recommend trying to rely a lot on memory for things, there's some things where it's not really always feasible to write it down. Like, so for example, recess is a time where creating the idea of teaching them to have a mental checklist of when they, go back in from recess, to think about what are the things they brought out with them, which probably shouldn't be much other than maybe a jacket, but or even, I mean, even for adults, like an example would be, if you're sitting down somewhere, anytime you get up, check your pockets to figure out what do you have. Like if you'll normally have, let's say, wallet, phone, and keys, check, kind of have the mental checklist in your mind to think, do I have these three things before I get up from wherever I am? Okay. So another thing that's common with ADHD, or certainly or executive functioning in general, is sometimes a hard time sitting still. And so a lot of times this leads to fidgeting, like fiddling with things on the table, maybe, or if child shakes their leg at the dinner table. But so what's really important, this isn't really a concept that's talked about that much. But what can be very helpful for, both in school and at home is to set up mindless movements to actually harness the fidgeting, which in turn can improve focus. Because I don't know if you remember earlier in the presentation, I mentioned how a child with ADHD can focus for a really long time on things that interest them, like video games or things that stimulate them. So what the movement does, if it's mindless, is it kind of creates a little bit of a gap. It fills in that gap of stimulation. So between the activity that they don't really want to do and the movement, it can make them more stimulated and in turn able to focus at least a little bit better. So the thing with homework is that a lot of times, especially on the computer, your child probably needs both hands to type. So it's probably not really feasible in a lot of cases to use hand fidgets for homework, but there's a lot you can do with feet. So, certainly, I mean, at school, you're probably a little more limited in what you can do. The kick bands, which are these little like stretchy bands that you can put on the chair legs. I mean, those are somewhat common in elementary school, but usually not as much after because kids are not going to remember to take it off of each seat and move it to the next class in middle school or high school. I mean, they might, but the point is, I don't think those are used quite as often in middle school or high school. But the kick bands can be helpful. But in general, at home, things like a desk bike, I can show you. They're like something like this. Basically you can just put it under your feet and pedal. And again, I mean, you can, they're like 25 or 30 bucks on Amazon. So, it's not like it's hundreds of dollars to buy. Again, I know it's so expensive, but it's not, it's not, but the point is that you can, and there's other stuff you can, create that you may have at home to make something like that. But the point is that basically, you can sort of pedal mindlessly while or the child can pedal mindlessly while they're doing homework. It can really help them to stay focused better. They make an elliptical version. They make like a little foot pedal thing. I think it's initially designed for circulation, but basically just the child can just tap up and down on it. I've seen ones where the kids kind of roll their feet on it and just has different sort of sensations. The point is that, be creative. There's a lot that you can do with it. Um, some of the other stuff with fidgeting that can be very helpful are, if your kids, have the ability to stand while they're doing homework, especially if they're small in elementary school, a kitchen counter height may work well, or if you have the ability to set up like some sort of like sit stand, desk, like a little topper thing you can put on top of a regular desk. Standing can be helpful. Sometimes with standing, a balance board can be a great way for kids to be able to, get some movement in mindlessly, like something like this. Like this one's called a whirly board. And so kids kind of find it fun because it kind of looks a little bit like a skateboard. You can kind of balance on it. So there's a lot kids can do. They make others that are more like a rocking board. But so the point is, like, these can be things that be great, not just for homework, but even for if you need to talk to your child about something they have a hard time focusing, talk to them while they're standing on the board, they might actually focus a little bit better. So, and there's also things like a yoga ball chair, a wobble stool, and if you, I should move over. You can see a wobble stool back here. But there's a lot that you can do sort of to, basically give a little bit of movement, but make the movement mindless. All right, so now we're gonna talk about strategies to keep you guys better organized as a parent, because there's a lot that goes into parenting, and it can definitely be very very challenging. There's a lot to keep track of, and countless emails from school and things. Especially if you have a child that has a hard time keeping on top of their own stuff, it then adds to the stuff that you need to do. And by the way, as far as questions go, please feel free to put questions in the chat as we go, and I'll certainly answer them. During the presentation if it makes sense, but if not, I've left plenty of time to have questions after, because I know that with our size group it'd be great to have a real dialogue and be able to ask questions and just get a good discussion going on things, because I think that's really a great way to learn from this. All right, so in terms of things to help you guys, so some of these principles are probably pretty similar to what I mentioned for helping your child. The idea is, first, keep any systems or tools as simple as possible. And when you have systems that involve multiple parents or other caregivers, whether it's a grandparent or whoever else may be helping you with things with your kids, it's also important to take into account a preference if someone likes something on paper or electronic or a specific program, and try to figure out some sort of system that everyone can agree on. Because it's hard to use a system with multiple people if someone really doesn't know how to use it or is unwilling to use it or won't use it, because then it's not going to work effectively. It's also really important to continually monitor how well systems are working, and not to be afraid to tweak or overhaul things when needed. I mean, usually if a system's going terribly, you sort of realize it, But beyond that, people don't always think about how can I make this better, or is this not working quite as well as it could. Probably my biggest thing, if you take nothing else from today away, don't trust your memory and assume you will remember things in a timely manner. That's a really important thing. I mean, if you've ever forgotten to pick your child up from something, or you've ever forgotten about an important like task, I don't know, permission slip, anything like that, sort of, sometimes those things stick with you. But the point is that you don't have to remember that kind of stuff in the moment if you have it written down and you have an alert that pops up, or you have a to-do list on paper that you look at. So the point is, don't rely on your memory for these things. Write them down in some shape or form. And again, everyone's different. I know some people really prefer stuff on paper, some people really like electronic stuff, some people kind of like stuff in between. But what I would say is, if you are using electronic things like a calendar or task list, use automated reminders when feasible. Same thing if you have an Amazon Echo or anything like that. Take advantage of those automated reminders, because then you don't have to constantly set reminders for things, especially if it's even something like taking out the trash. If it's normally the same trash day every day, once a week, unless there's a holiday or something, you can set the reminder once and it keeps going off, each week. The other thing to really think about as a general principle is to really try to model good organizational skills for your kids, because they pick up on a lot. Certainly they pick up on the habits that are not so great, but they also pick up a lot on the habits that are. And so if you naturally model stuff without sometimes making too big a deal out of it, because the problem is sometimes if you overdo it in terms of illustrating and saying, oh, I do this, you should do this too, they're probably going to push back and not be that interested in it. But if they say, oh, I need you to buy me X, Y, or Z, or I need you to sign this permission slip for me, and pull your phone, add a task reminders app and say, I'm setting a reminder for, I don't know, Sunday at 5 p.m. and I'll take care of it then. They're seeing that you have a plan. As long as you follow through on it, they're seeing that it works. And if they have let's say they have an iPad or a phone, they may be more interested in, oh, let me try that as well myself too, and see if that's helpful to me. So the point is modeling good organizational skills. Same thing with a calendar. Having a shared family calendar can be a great way to incorporate kids into using a calendar from a young age, because they just sort of expect it as, oh, this is a natural thing, people do it. Whereas suddenly if you introduce a calendar to them when they're 15 or 16, while it's never too late, it becomes a little more sort of feeling of, oh, it's a chore, or I have to learn to adjust this. So like the younger you can introduce these things, oftentimes the better. Okay. So now we're really getting into for you guys as parents, caregivers, how to manage, schedule and tasks, identifying conflicts, and improving efficiency. So my strong suggestion would be to have a master list where all events, activities are written down. So this could be an electronic shared family calendar, such as Apple or Google Calendar. There's a promo code Cozy. You can use this, great. Or, whatever is the simplest way to keep track, a master list of all the events that everyone can have access to at all times can be helpful. Because this way, because here's the problem. Like, let's say, I don't know, your child's father takes your child to, I don't know, the dentist and schedules the next dentist appointment. If they put it even in a phone on their calendar, but don't put it on your calendar and forget to tell you about it, then you have no idea when that dentist appointment is. You may schedule something else that conflicts. So the idea is, by having a master record that everyone that's involved can see, you're far less likely to double book, your kids or even yourselves. It's also really important with a calendar or with tasks, to also plan travel time, and to add locations in, because it's great to know, oh, soccer practice starts at 5:30, but it's also really important to know, where is soccer practice and where is the game, because then you can plan effectively to figure out, what time do I need to leave? Is this a time where there's gonna be a lot of traffic based on location, where I need to allow a lot of extra time? And when it makes sense to, even noting in the event, who's going to take the child to the event and who's doing pickup. Because there are times where you may assume, oh, so-and-so is going to do this, but, it may not always occur to that other person that, oh, they're probably going to do this. And being able to just recognize that really helps, especially when you're maneuvering around, like even on weekends. If kids that have a lot of activities and you're constantly like juggling, getting kids from one activity to the next, knowing exactly where every event is and which parent, or grandparent or caregiver, whoever else is involved helping, or even a carpool, is going to get your kid to each event is important. Color coding can be very helpful as well. There's a lot you can do. The point is, write it down and, figure out a plan that works for you. Okay, in terms of shared tasks, so a lot of times, people get the calendar piece of it, but the idea of a task, I think, is often more challenging. I find in that because there's the aspect of having to keep track of what you do in the first place, but there's also the act of planning out when to do it and allocating time to it. But for tasks that involve other people, having a shared list of some kind can be very helpful. So, if you and whoever else is involved in caring for your kids have an Apple device, you should have the reminders app on your phone or Mac. Um, if you have a Mac, but in general, if you have an iPhone, you should have the reminders app, or if not, you can download if you've deleted it or something. But basically, it's a basic task list, but you can share a list with someone else. And you can assign tasks. So it's great because you can basically add a task in, assign it to someone, and then this way everyone can see all the tasks in one place. And you can set due dates. Other options. You could create a Google Doc table and add a task list into there. There's various some of the newer sort of not there's drop down menu options. There's also the smart chips that you can add. Like there's a task list option you can add in. And if those of you, if you don't use Google Docs that much, you probably can ask your kids and they probably can help you with it. Because I realize that a lot of times, kids tend to use Google Docs more. But the point is, and the reason I stress a Google Doc as far as the document goes, is just because it's automatically, you can use an app on a phone to pull it up pretty easily. Whereas if you use the Word document, it's a lot harder to share it unless you do Dropbox or some other thing. But it often creates more steps to try to share any sort of Word document. And at that point, it's probably easier just to use an actual task list app. If it's stuff and you don't have to have it on the go all the time, you could certainly, or in addition to that, you could certainly use a whiteboard in a common area. If you have like some sort of shared office or a bedroom. I'm suggesting this like if you want it in a place where your kids may not see it. Obviously, you can leave it, out in a common area, which is helpful. But I would definitely suggest if you have kids that are likely to go and erase the board if there's an activity on there they don't want to do or a task that you don't want them to do, then I would just be mindful of making sure you know exactly sort of what's on there and not keeping it right where they can see it. Okay, so it's great to put all this stuff into a task list and a calendar, but where the planning comes in and really reviewing stuff is to actually take the time to preview the week ahead, whether you do it by yourself, with whoever else is sort of involved, in your kid's life, being able to like, maybe once a week, either have a weekly parent meeting or a family meeting, with your kids also to review the schedule for the next week. Because it allows you to catch things very quickly if there's any conflicts or if there's a question of who's going to drive someone to such and such event, or like based on someone's work schedule, if they're not necessarily out by a certain time, who's going to ensure the child's ready to go for the activity. And because this way it's much easier to make a plan and address any conflicts now, in advance rather than suddenly the day of or before realizing, oh wait, I don't have a ride for my child for this. If you set up tasks like, let's say, scheduling the next dentist appointment or a doctor's appointment, it can be, having a weekly meeting also creates accountability to be able to check in to look at what is the status of taking care of whatever it is. Because having the mutual accountability can often help. It can definitely be very helpful to make an actual plan for stuff, especially when you have a day that's very chaotic. I don't know if this sample schedule looks like anyone else's schedule sometimes on a weekend, but pretty much in all this is sort of an all-day activity with sort of all parents sort of on call to kind of get their kids from one activity to the other. With in this example, having kids having activity in the morning, and then let's say one kid has a basketball game, and then the other kid's a soccer game, and then another basketball game. So, and then they're playing at dinner. So the point is that basically, while to some people this may seem like a very simple schedule, for others this may feel very complicated. But if your schedule feels very complicated with stuff to do, it's often good to really map out a plan, because then you know ahead of time what to. And you can write it out just like this. It doesn't have to just be in a calendar. Like it's easier to actually write it out and say, this is the plan of where we have to be each time and who's going to do what, how we're going to feed the kids. It's definitely good because obviously you want to feed your kids, and that's definitely important. Obviously, in this example, we have dinner. I'm realizing actually in the example here, we actually didn't even include lunch. So again, these things can be hard to always think about and remember. So that's why the more you plan it out, the more you're likely to sort of not forget about things that are vital to making the schedule work well. Okay, so in terms of like a task plan, so as far as like the example, like let's say I don't know you sign your child up for I don't know for the spring baseball season. So maybe you make a plan where I don't know the dad's going to do it by Sunday, November 23rd, and then it says I'll try to do it on the 15th, but it has like an actual deadline. This way you can sort of check each week to look at, is this done? Or, but have a sense of here's the deadline that you're planning to have it done by. Or let's say the mom needs to reschedule Johnny's dentist appointment. So the idea is that, she has the deadline for herself when she's going to do it, but she also then looks at when she's actually likely available to have time to do it. So maybe she knows on November 20th, she might have a lighter day of work, or maybe she knows she's, I don't know, taking the day off or something, or gets an early release. And so the idea is that maybe she then knows that she'll have time and can do it then. It's also really important if you have a system like whiteboards with weekly schedule, it's important to have a plan to actually update them, because they're not helpful if they're sitting there, with the schedule from 2 or 3 weeks ago. So you want to make sure if you have a system that you're actually using it, and if needed, actually make a plan of when you're going to update each week. So this way it gets updated in a timely manner. Because the other problem is if it's not labeled well and it's not updated, your kids, especially if they're old enough to be independent sometimes, may look at the schedule and get confused and do the wrong thing if the schedule is different one week to next and they don't realize what week it is and that's not updated. Okay, so here I have an example of the Reminders app and Todoist, which are two taskless programs. The Reminders app, I mean, for anyone that has an Apple device, you can pull it up on your phone right now if you want to look at it and see what it looks like if you've never used it. And then Todoist is somewhat similar. Todoist definitely has a little more in the way of like planning functionality than the Reminders app does. But they're both great programs. They both allow sharing, so you can share certain lists, but not all of them. So in the example here, I just had a couple examples of getting a tires replaced on a car, preparing lunch for the week, going food shopping. The thing though is, it's great to have something in here in terms of a task, but you also want to have a plan of when you're going to do it. Because otherwise, sometimes lists turn into just a bunch of things on a list. They don't really get done because you don't have a sense of when you're going to do them, because you have to figure out when you're free. So with food shopping, the thing would be to look at, like, when are you actually free to go food shopping? And to actually make a plan, look at when you're actually available and block out that time in your schedule to go food shopping. Or, planning food for the week in terms of, maybe getting lunch stuff ready so it's easier to grab and go each day and have less you have to pack from scratch each day. So over here, you have kind of on this, I think a lot of apps I've talked about, probably, I think a few I may not have really gotten to directly, but they're organized by categories. So you have this list. As far as like newer or other programs, I'm thinking also. I realize I guess I didn't really talk about AI at all, earlier in the presentation, but certainly there's a lot you can do with that to to work on planning out tasks. You can use certainly you can use, I mean, any AI program to like put in a schedule. There are some programs that are specifically like built for like planning out tasks and stuff, which can definitely be helpful. So I mean, there's one actually that it's okay. It was one that I created called ADHD Assist that I created. That's basically it uses I think manuscript from one of the books I've written and some other materials to be programmed specifically to focus on helping people to plan out tasks. There's also a student version for assignments, but the idea is that any AI program, if you know the right prompts, as long as it's programmed, it can help to some degree. But the problem is that it's also very easy to get sidetracked if you just sort of put in a bunch of stuff and don't really have a clear guide in what you're doing with it. So it's definitely important to just make sure you know where the information is pulling from if you're using any sort of AI program. And so over here we have just chat.org is a great resource for things with ADHD and a lot of executive function stuff. I write a fair amount of articles, so there's a link there to my website that has a bunch of articles I've written for Attention Magazine, for Washington Parent Magazine, and I think a couple others as well. So I'd really love, we have plenty of time left. I'd love to take questions. I really like to sort of have time to really, if you have a problem, let's work on solving it. So I'm definitely love to hear any questions people have on things they're struggling with or they'd like to get answers on. So it's be a great opportunity to really do that.
Please feel free to come off of chat. I'm sorry, off of mute, or put your comments or questions in the chat. All right, if there are no questions, thank you so much, Mr. Heller, for your presentation today. We will have this recording posted on our YouTube channel as well. And I am going to share my screen again.
I did have a quick question.
Okay, go ahead.
So sorry. Where, and you may have said this in the beginning, but where do you, I guess, where's the first place you think parents should start to maybe help a special needs child with executive functioning skills in elementary school? Is it starting with visual schedules, and that's a kind of basic way to start?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think you have to identify where. I mean, the problem is if you try to target everything at once, it's going to be very overwhelming. And so the idea is you want to look at like probably what's the most pressing need. So like visual schedules, if they have a hard time keeping track of the schedule, can definitely be very helpful to start. Yeah, visual schedules can definitely be good. I would say probably that and homework and looking at kind of planning out homework, even just the base, even if they have two assignments elementary school each day, to just even if they have them two written out on a whiteboard near where they do homework and then they mark it off each day. Just starting really simple can often help really improve the skills over time because it is a big transition going from elementary school to middle school, and so really working on kind of the idea of having a routine to be able to know when to do homework and to actually have rely on looking at something written down to do the homework rather than just relying on memory is really crucial.
How long does it take students to kind of adjust and get in the rhythm, do you think? So you start with the morning routine schedule and the homework schedule. Is it the concept of say doing it for a month and then it will feel more natural to them?
I mean, it's hard to say. I think it really depends on the person. It also depends what certification or challenges they also have, because sometimes if they, sometimes it can take longer to get into routine in the first place if they have a lot of executive function weaknesses. And also, if they lose interest in it, it may be harder to sustain sort of the routine also. But I would say, usually, I mean, there's often like the novelty of something when it's new. So like the first few days, like once you sort of get into it, for some kids, sometimes it's easiest because it's sort of new. And if it's exciting, they're more likely to do it. But once that novelty wears off, it sort of loses it. That's where like really trying to like hone stuff in the first week or two to really like work on the follow through can make a huge difference, like in developing something into a routine. But I mean, I would think, I mean, the hope would be sort of really a lot of it also that was about the idea of having a being able to kind of follow through on like catching something that's not working well. Because the problem is if you set up a system and it doesn't work super well to start, and then your child just kind of stops using it, and then suddenly a month later you go to revisit it, it's pretty much probably as if it never occurred because it was so far long. Whereas like if you're working on it like continually, you're reviewing progress, look at what's going on, and I don't know, 3 days later you look at it and realize he stopped using it, it's much easier to get back on track with it.
Thank you. This was very helpful. Thanks for the presentation.
You're very welcome.
Anybody else have any questions for Mr. Heller? All right. Thank you so much, Mr. Heller.
You're welcome. Thanks all for having me. And thanks for everyone for joining
Absolutely.
today.
All right. So we do want to just remind you guys that we do have the upcoming the next session coming up tomorrow with Miss Chesko. So go ahead and scan the QR code if you haven't already done so if you would like to attend. And then we have our final session on November 5th again with Miss Chesko. So go ahead and scan the QR code if you would like to attend those upcoming sessions as well. I'll give you a couple minutes or seconds. And then we also have the parent focus group going on at we had our first session today as well, and then we have another session in the next couple of days, depending on your school level. If you would like to sign up, go ahead and scan that QR code as well, so that the interest form, and then we'll send you the Zoom link to the session for the age appropriate. And then we also have the behavior changes support group starting up this Thursday. The first session is from 6:30 to 8 o'clock. So go ahead and scan that QR code if you would like to join us or any of the sessions upcoming this cohort. And then here is where you can find a recording in the next couple of days of today's presentation and any of our presentations that we've had in the past and in the future. And of course, we have our X link, and then if you want to join our listserv. This is us at the Family Support Center and how you can contact us, our phone number, and you can again scan our QR code to be added to our listserv. And finally, if you can take a moment to scan this QR code to fill out our exit ticket, we would greatly appreciate that. And once you have finished that, we are all set. And we thank you for joining us for our session today. And thank you again, Mr. Heller. We hope you all have a good night.
Wait before you take the QR code down, please. It was on my phone. 1 second. Is it still up? There we go.
Yes, it is. It is. Yep. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night. All right. Thank you so much, ladies. Have a good night.